Okay, start off with this. It's probably a good question to start with. What is the point of coming to a retreat? I have always been a law-abiding citizen and an obedient child. Kindly explain the benefits. Well, for me, my way into Buddhism began as a teenager when I looked around me and I just felt everything was very fake and empty and pretty well a waste of time. I couldn't see anybody anywhere that I could look up to as a role model and think in 10, 20 years I would like to be like this person. I had no interest in making money, being successful, although I think I probably could have done that if I wanted to. I was always top of my class from when I was in junior school, and academically very successful, but I had no interest in that. The questions that I was interested in asking, nobody else seemed interested in at all, and they were, what's a good way to live? What's the best way to live? If you're in this world for 60, 70, 80 years, what should you try and do with your life to make it really worthwhile? That was one question, very important. Another one was, why is the world like this? Why is the world such a miserable place? Why is there so much suffering in the world? Why is there so much injustice? Why is there so much hatred, selfishness, greed? Why is it like this? Does it have to be like this? Is there anything that can be done about it? And if there is something that can be done to decrease the amount of suffering in the world and increase the amount of happiness in the world, then what is your responsibility as a human being to try to contribute to that? So most of my friends thought I was weird, and I felt really alienated, and so more or less as soon as I could, I left England and haven't hardly been back there ever again since I was 17 years old. But for myself, I think that just being a law-abiding citizen and an obedient child is okay, yeah, it's a good thing. I'm anumotana, but it's a kind of a pretty low standard. It's a pretty kind of narrow idea of what it can be to be a human being in this world, and what the challenges and the opportunities and the possibilities of this human birth are. I think it's kind of like dreary kind of attitude. Well, I'm all right. I don't break the laws. I make some money, do all right. So my response to that kind of worldview, right or wrong, since I was a teenager, is so what? Yeah, you make a lot of money. So what? What for? Ultimately, what for? What's the real purpose? So when you die, you've got $1 million in the bank. So what? What's the difference between dying with $1 million in the bank and dying with $10 in the bank? You're going to die anyway. What's it all for? What is it that can really give life a sense of meaning and purpose? It was with that kind of questioning that I rejected religious tradition, which I grew up, I found Christianity completely unsatisfying, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. I started to study philosophy, psychology, pretty well neglected all my curriculum. But in those days it was a little bit easier for people like me because you didn't have so much testing, and I'm very good at cramming. So if I just spent like 5 or 6 days before an exam and just really studied hard, I could pass all my exams very well. So it left the rest of the term I just neglect all my studies. Teachers used to get quite upset, and I'd study. I wasn't just hanging out, I was studying, but studying other things that I was really interested in. So I'm not suggesting that you do this, by the way, but this was my particular path. So finally I came across the teachings of the Buddha, and they just made complete sense to me. It just seemed so obvious, not something exotic and Asian, but just completely obvious that human beings have wonderful potential, but it's a potential that only can be realized through study and through practice and effort, and that following the Buddha's teachings, one has an opportunity to abandon all the causes of suffering in one's own heart, and is able to help to reduce the amount of suffering, increase the amount of happiness and welfare in the society in which one lives. So this was for me like a guiding principle, an education, not of particular academic topic, subject, but an education of my whole life, in terms of my conduct, my speech, my emotions, my thoughts, my views, taking on the Buddha's teachings as an education process, and finding the fulfillment in that, but also developing the tools and the understanding with which to help others also. So my initial intention in going on retreats was to learn some life skills to develop the ability to deal with my own mind. I felt, looking at myself and looking at others, just how weak and indulgent and scattered and trivial my life was, and that it didn't have to be that way. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't something imprinted on my genes. It's a result of choices that I made moment by moment. So Buddhism is teaching us, giving us the ability to make wiser choices in our life. I think many of you, or I hope some of you, will be familiar with famous psychology experiments performed in New York in the early 60s. They had a huge repercussions, huge impact on academic and wider circles. In these experiments, volunteers were requested, and I think they're actually paid to participate in these psychology experiments. If you were one of these people who volunteered, you'd go into a large room, and with everybody in the room looking very scientific, with white coats and various sort of scientific paraphernalia, And then you'd be told that you were going to participate in an experiment to gauge the correlation between learning and punishment. And you would be shown a rather fat man sitting on a chair in a glass case, glass room, which was hooked up to an electrical system. Outside there were a number of buttons going from 10 volts way up to 200, 300 volts, which is potentially life-threatening. You'd be told that you ask this person these questions, and if they cannot answer, you give them an electric shock to see whether that will make them answer any more quickly, try harder. Now if you give a 10 volt shock and he can't answer, then the next time you give a 20 volt and you can just keep going up the scale. And oh yes, one other thing that you'd be told is that this person has heart disease, so giving him an electric shock might be a little bit dangerous. So you start to answer this guy's questions, and he starts to sweat and look uncomfortable. He can't think of the answers. He starts to panic. You give him a 10 volt shock, it makes it worse. You give him 20, and he can't answer. He's really losing it. And you start to go up the scale, and he's starting to scream a little bit. Now, this experiment with variations was carried on a number of many days, and in fact it was a setup, as most of these really good psychology experiments are, that the man in the chair was an actor, and it wasn't really hooked up to the electrical system. It wasn't an electric chair. He wasn't really being shocked. The experiment wasn't really to see the connection or the correlation between punishment and learning. What it was interested in seeing was whether ordinary people off the street, law-abiding citizens, would be under certain circumstances willing to give potentially life-threatening electric shocks to another human being if they believed that they wouldn't have to take any responsibility for it. And in fact, many people, when the man started to scream, they would turn to the scientist there and they say, "Is this all right? He looks like he's in pain." They said, yes, we'll take responsibility. It's just part of the experiment. Don't worry about it. And it turns out that I think 70 or 80% of the people went right up to the highest level of electric shock, like 200-300 volts, which is really incredibly painful if it was real. Now these experiments were in the, still in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it was a huge question, and one that's never really been resolved. Is Germany was in many ways the leader of European culture in the mid-20th century, and the greatest philosophers, the greatest composers, greatest writers, scientists, all coming from Germany, or so many of them coming from Germany. And yet this country, which was the leader of Western culture, could within a few years become a Nazi culture, one in which, for instance, 6 million Jewish people were killed horribly, and in which waged war on many countries and were incredibly cruel, and so on. And so how do you explain that? And if you put forward the argument there was just a small number of psychopaths or monsters, it doesn't really explain how this whole system was able to sustain itself for so long. And what you find is that many of the people who did the worst and cruelest and terrible things were, before the Second World War began, just ordinary law-abiding citizens. And if the society hadn't changed in that way, they may have lived their life that way. The point being that morality, kindness, compassion, honesty, so many of these qualities, unless they've been systematically developed, tend to be extremely superficial and can disappear overnight. You can, many people, the majority of people, can be rather kind and unselfish, but because surrounding the situation and conditions allow them to be that way, or encourage them to be that way, but because they've never consciously developed those qualities in their mind, it's just like automatic, unthinking, sort of sleepwalking kind of virtues. Suddenly things change and you're put on the spot, and it's more difficult to be virtuous than it is to be unvirtuous. It's easier to be cruel than it's to be kind. Many people just become cruel because it's easier, because they've always followed the easy way. So this is the danger. When everything comes very easily, you just take the easy path again and again and again, and then that becomes who you are, the person who takes whatever's the easiest path. So if you're fortunate enough to live in a society or in a family where the choices you're encouraged to make are good ones, then maybe you get away with it. But if suddenly things change and you're in a situation where it's easier to be dishonest and cruel and selfish, then you'll probably be that way, because you don't have any core to your being. You just follow whatever is given. And so that very kind of conditioned, superficial, sleepwalking kind of existence is normal and completely natural, and is in fact in many ways encouraged in the society in which we live. So for me, Buddhist practice and coming on a retreat is part of this. Means taking an interest in self-development, developing a real core of meaning and purpose in your life, taking responsibility for your life, not just sort of floating along and just following the party line, whatever it may be, but really finding out for yourself what life's all about, and finding a way towards some sense of real inner value and worth. So to do that you need certain mental strength, integrity, self-discipline. These kinds of qualities may not be very popular these days, and not very many people aspire to them, but it's a timeless truth that without them you can't really achieve anything very much. And to think, you want to achieve something. I mean, to be a little bit direct. I mean, how many of you could stop talking yesterday? How many of you even tried? There again is this. This is where you can really see. I mean, what happens is we follow our desires, but we follow what's easy, and then probably you come up with some kind of reason for it afterwards to explain it, so you feel a little bit better about yourself when you're unable to keep to a particular standard or promise. So in fact, the modern education system is one which is often giving you more and more sophisticated excuses for following your desires, rather than making you more rational. It means that you have very much more skillful at creating rationalizations for conduct, rather than being more rational. So to put it on a slightly more positive note, there's a huge amount of research these days basically made possible through latest technologies such as MRI machines to establish the value of developing mindfulness, and the results that are out there now in the scientific community, which are undisputed, are, for instance, the effects on the immune system. People who meditate a lot tend to have a much more robust immune system, which means they're much less likely to develop physical illness. They are able to handle stress much better. There are changes in brain function and brain structure as a result of a sustained meditation practice. These days they talk of certain the brain is often divided into 3 levels or 3 parts. So you have what's called the reptile brain, the mammalian brain, and the sort of the higher cortex. So this idea that the evolution of mankind, you start off with this reptile brain, which is basically, fight or flight. So like strong emotions for procreation or for survival. And then we develop the emotional brain, the mammalian brain, and then the truly human brain, the rational faculties and so on, are in the cortex of the last development of the brain. So sometimes these different parts of the brain don't work in harmony very well. We have like caveman emotions in modern sophisticated environments, and they bypass or hijack the more rational kinds of thought. For instance, let's say you see something in the distance. Now it's not clear enough for you to see exactly what it is, but your reptile brain kicks in first, and if it sees that it might possibly be something dangerous, then it will send all these signals to your body, all this adrenaline, and you're ready to fight or you're ready to run away. And then it's only some fractions of a second later that the perception of what that thing is appears. So your reptile brain might have said, looks like it could be a snake, and so you have sort of all these anti-snake snake protection chemicals running through you, ready. But then a fraction of a second later, you see it's a piece of rope. But then you all these emotions come up, all these chemicals are running through your body, because you're afraid of a snake before you even see the snake. It's a safety first kind of system. And this is also an explanation of why is it that we're always more interested in bad news than good news, or why is it that newspapers are always full of bad news rather than good news? It's part of the way our brains are. Because if something is bad news in your immediate environment and you miss it, you might get eaten or killed. But if something's good news, like there's some fruit trees, a couple of kilometre walk up there, or there's an animal you can hunt over there. If you miss out on the good news, it's not going to have an immediate serious impact. So bad things have always been more important to the brain than good things, because if you're heedless about a bad thing, you might die. If you're heedless about a good thing, you won't. So this is some way the brain works. So what I wanted to say was that in this frontal cortex, which has what's nowadays called executive functions, which means the higher functions of thinking, analysis, creativity, decision making. In fact, all these functions are nowadays grouped under a term called executive functions. Now, they measured the part of the brain which is associated with these executive functions, and it starts to shrivel, after a certain age. But if you look at the brain of a 60-year-old meditator, somebody who's been meditating most of their life, they have the same kind of integrity of this area of the brain as someone 10 or 15 years younger than them. So there are these kinds of studies coming out now which saying that a regular meditation practice doesn't just affect the way your brain works moment by moment, but affects actual structural changes, prevents the deterioration of certain parts of the brain. And unless you have a strong hereditary or genetic likelihood of getting Alzheimer's, someone who meditates regularly is very unlikely to develop that kind of illness. The restraint and the ability to delay gratification, the ability to control negative emotions, to deal with negative emotions effectively, to promote positive emotions, to experience inner happiness. These are all the kinds of benefits of meditation practice. So it seems to me that if you can embark upon a particular kind of education which is good for you physically, meaning that you're less likely to get physically ill, you get better more quickly when you are ill, you're able to deal with physical pain much more skillfully, one in which you're developing skillful means to deal with negative emotions and to promote positive emotions when you're creating the conditions for the efficient working of the higher mental faculties like critical and creative thinking, then I think meditation is well worth the effort. Okay, because there's only one question, I give a long answer to that one, but is there anything, any more questions, or anybody would like to just ask something or respond to what I've just said? Please. Yes.
I have a question about emotions.
Yeah.
So one feels happy in the absence of suffering, and one feels suffering in the absence of happiness.
Yeah.
And so my understanding is that wisdom teaches you to remove yourself from emotions, and in doing so find true happiness. So the question is, how does one find true happiness first understanding true suffering?
Yeah, I have to kind of deconstruct that question a little bit. There is, because the words that we use in English are so imprecise. English is a really good language for like technical subject, but when you start talking about the human mind, it's very imprecise and it's very open to confusion. So there's one level of pleasure. Let's maybe use the word pleasure rather than happiness. So in fact,